I do have new notes. We have a new set of notes this week. We are...
Yesterday, I was looking at it, but doing all of it, and then smelling, I thought, sure it's in your case. Open it up.
Think about 3 more minutes and I'll be ready. I'm sorry that it... Is there any more coffee anywhere that I could have?
The sugar seems pretty full.
Woohoo! Gonna come. Danke. Alright. How was everybody's week? So far, so good! Well, that is basically all we have, isn't it? Let's just pray and remember that this is much more than matters of physical bodies and physical warfare, but also a matter of spirit. Father, I thank you that you've placed us in a time and place where we can depend on you. Lord, we thank you for the privilege of having been raised in an environment where we were protected from the most trying struggles that affect the world. We've missed all the major wars, we've missed all the major famines, we've missed all the major plagues that have happened to the world since the time we were born. And we're grateful for that you've protected us and you've made a hedge around us and you've put us in a country where usually stuff like that doesn't happen to people like us. We thank you that tidal waves and forest fires and earthquakes and all those other things, volcanoes, just don't happen to Britain much. Oh Lord, I thank you for the humility that this brings, that stuff like this does happen to people like us. This created world in all of its futility is something that we are a part of, and the suffering of people in faraway countries is our suffering, and I thank you for the way that improves the condition of our hearts and makes us more like you. Thank you that you yourself were subject to physical limitations. You came to the world to be hungry and be tired and be frustrated with people. But I thank you that you came to unveil a heavenly reality on the world where there will no longer be any sickness or death or pain or crying or sadness. Those things will all pass away. Lord, until that day, we are determined to hold on in faith that you will deliver your people, that you will save us, that you will heal us, that you will protect us, and that you will bless us. And that out of that, Lord God, you will bless the whole earth. And I pray that each of us will be able to be good witnesses to that, and that we would, in this messy, quarantined, epidemic time, that you would work powerfully in our lives to change the condition of our hearts and make sure that we're motivated by love, and that we're motivated out of worship, and we're motivated out of a desire to see your glory come to the earth more than ever. And as we open this book of Isaiah, this witness to an ancient time where you did that, but where you didn't stop the war, where you did that, but you didn't stop the plague necessarily. Lord, we want to understand, we want to believe, we want to be able to be witnesses to all that ourselves. And so as we open this book and make our limited efforts to understand it, I pray that your Holy Spirit would work in our hearts to make us see all the things we need to. In Jesus' name, amen. Good. Now, as we've been doing Isaiah so far, we did a kind of introductory session which helped us to see the whole book. And we were introduced to the different questions about authorship and who wrote the book of Isaiah and when. We looked at the whole kind of book of Isaiah and what kind of style it is. We understood that It almost reads a bit like a Shakespeare play with not so much backstory for each character. So what you have is a scene or an act that will open, and there'll be people that come in and speak and proclaim, and God himself will speak, and then those characters will sort of come to an end. We note that there's often a sort of phase change that happens whenever a king dies, or there's a big change in the government, that kind of thing. And then Isaiah starts speaking to them separately. So where we are at the moment is we've finished the third of those acts, and we're going to begin number 4. So there's a new handout which will take us through the next 3 or so. So feel free to take one of those. Please don't sneeze on them as you pass. I trust you've all washed your hands with soap. Because you always would have, right? Thanks again to the Ministry of Caffeine, who have sponsored our coffee and things for today. Please don't pass germs on if you can avoid it, but let's keep drinking coffee and studying the Bible. So we're going to pick up the text around about chapter 23. So if you'll remember, last week we learned all about how Judah as a kingdom, Jerusalem as a city, is sort of on the ropes as Assyria, its large northern neighbour, basically kills off and digests all the kingdoms around it. The only power anybody can sort of think of to challenge Assyria and put an end to all this conquest is Babylon, but Babylon's just been defeated by Assyria, and the second option is Egypt. So everyone's saying, maybe Egypt with their huge army and their massive resources, maybe they will be able to challenge Assyria. And there's a whole load of comings and goings of people sending diplomats to each other, trying to make sure that they can get the right contacts to work together against this terrible thing. But what is Isaiah's message about this time of regional conflict and war? What is his main thrust?
It will happen. Just trust in the Lord that it will be alright.
Okay, this is going to happen. This is part of God's judgment against our society, and you can no more change it than you can roll back the tide by yourself. So what Isaiah is saying is that our job is basically keep calm and carry on. It's not going to help us to plot to try and win friends in Babylon or Egypt. All of those nations have rejected God too, and he'll have a plan for them. It's definitely not our favourite idea to submit to Assyria, because they're evil and horrible and they destroy everybody and they're going to destroy us. But Isaiah is saying this is a judgment. This is something that is being unveiled on us, and we can't control it or stop it. It will be God's plan, Isaiah says, to change Jerusalem from being the seat of a kingdom to being the seat of a faith. And instead of just being the God of the nation of Israel, would someone mind shutting that window, please? I think the sirens are a bit much. I got it. There we go. So instead of being the seat of a kingdom with a son of David sat on the throne, Isaiah is basically already saying in 700 BC that those times are coming to an end. And that instead what we're going to have is Jerusalem as the centre of faith in the world. And God is unveiling himself as saying, I am the Lord of Israel, I am the God of Jacob, I am the kind of king of Jerusalem, the real king of my people, but I'm also the king of everybody. I'm the king of all nations. And this sort of 700 BC kind of time is where people were realizing that in Israel. So Amos comes, he's writing about this time too, and God says, am I the Lord of Judah only, or Israel only? Am I not, I brought you guys up out of Egypt. Didn't I bring the Philistines also from Caphtor? Didn't I bring am I not the God of Damascus as well? Am I not the only God who's worthy of the title? So Isaiah is helping to sort of help everybody see that it's not really about just our little country. It's about all countries, all people. The promise to Abraham, the original goal of God working with humanity, was to see that every nation was blessed by Abraham's seed, right? And so far in history, in Isaiah's time, we've only really got one kingdom of people that's hanging on to the law and the covenants, who's believing in the name of God Most High, the one God who made the universe and everything in it. They're really the only ones doing this. And Isaiah sees the future, which is that the people are supposed to disperse that into the nations, to say, well, this is going to be the God of all nations. and chronicling the destruction of the neighbours of Judah. So under the time of Assyria, we've had Damascus, we've had the northern kingdom of Israel or Samaria, we've had Edom, we've had Aram, we've had Babylon, we've had all sorts of little kingdoms that have all been kind of broken down and chopped up and eaten by Assyria. And what Isaiah is promising at this moment is not only is Judah going to escape it and God is going to save them, but he's also going to make them humbled by something else later on. Like, even if he saves you from Assyria, which shows you that he's with you, eventually this is going to happen. Temples going, kingdoms going, that's happening. Okay, so don't worry, don't fear. We have something greater than an earthly kingdom to trust in. Does that make sense? Good. Now that should be noted as a radical departure from Israelite worship so far. So in the time of Moses, maybe 500 to 700 years before, Moses is saying this law, this government, this priesthood, this testament is for you as the people of God. And if anyone wants to join the people of God, they have to become an Israelite and join us. We are the people of God. We are the one nation chosen out of all the families of the earth to be God's people. And the Jewish people who live across the world today would still stand on that promise and say that we are a holy people, we're God's people, we didn't choose it, but he chose us, and that's just the deal. But we as Christians say, well, what God has been doing since the beginning is starting with one small group and slowly filling the whole earth. And that motif, that kind of whole perspective to say every nation and not just our nation, is what takes place through the unveiling of the Old Testament as we go. So have a look at your new sheets. There's page 1 here. I'm going to read this through together. So Act 4 works by two main themes running continuously and weaving in and out. The first is God's supreme power and authority, planning the course of events and then decisively judging Tyre, judging the kings, judging the land, judging Leviathan, which is perhaps best seen as a sort of spiritual representation of Tyre in the heavenly realm. The second theme is something like a bit like spiritual natural causes. So like if somebody comes into the doctor and he's got a hugely gangrenous leg, for instance, you could say, well, the person's problem is that they have gangrene and they need some surgery to fix it. But you could also say, how did it get like this? And that's what Isaiah says to the nation. It's like, well, your problem is that this is going to happen because it's so bad. But how did it get like this? Well, I'll tell you how it got like this. It all started with things like the land is defiled by the broken covenant, by the blood guilt of innocent people being killed in wars for power and things. And these are not primarily happening because God is actively doing them per se. So God is not twisting the screw on the poor to create the problem. What he's done is he's put people into the situation who then acted, and now because they have oppressed the poor, it's time for God to judge the people in charge. So the people's own actions and the consequences of which are at work because of covenant and justice at large as sort of universalizing principles. So the reigning glory of God Almighty in Zion is the only antidote, Isaiah says, to both maladies. He pronounces salvation and amnesty for everybody in Jerusalem who will come and worship him, and he promises to swallow up everlasting death and defeat all the evil forces at work. Welcome, very come on in and sit down. There's some sheets somewhere. I don't know if anyone could find them there. Oh, look at that. So we're just on page 1 there, paragraph 2. He's got one. So the setting is the siege of Jerusalem by Assyria, while that empire is at the peak of its powers. The years 700 to 640 BC were marked by massive battles between Egypt and Assyria, in which Judah and Jerusalem are basically spectators. Like it happens in their backyard, but they've got nothing to contribute. They really are tiny by comparison. A bit like Germany and France go to war and it's Luxembourg that's sort of sandwiched in between, but it's just a passenger in it all. They're not going to be able to change much. So Manasseh, however dire a king, however adulterous and idolatrous, wisely stayed out of these battles. Tyre, however, opted to back Egypt and was crushed by Assyria. Manasseh was actually taken to Nineveh, that's the capital city of Assyria, to answer questions about which side he was on. You can read about that in 2 Chronicles 33. But he was sent back to Judah and allowed to stay in charge after they find that basically there's no good reason to attack Jerusalem again. Manasseh sends workers to help build parts of Nineveh and another city, Kar-Eshadon. Kings and Chronicles record this unfavourably. Manasseh basically sells out his own people. So 2 Kings 21 and 2 Chronicles 33. Because it basically amounted to idolatry and apostasy. So the king of Judah is selling out his kingdom to basically pay off Assyria. And the prophets and the chroniclers are like, that was a bad move. That was really selling us out. But at the same time, there's not really much else he could do. And from Isaiah's perspective, there is no alternative to accepting Assyria's suzerainty. That's a funny word. It's a bit like sovereignty, but it means that someone else is kind of ruling on your behalf. For Isaiah, the time of independent Israel is over, and God himself is ruling not just over his own people in Canaan, but over all the earth. We need not fear or rebel against Assyria, because God is in charge. This is something he is doing, and we don't have to be afraid of it. Does that make sense? Okay, so have a look at these scenes. I've picked out 7 scenes in quite a short set of chapters. So the first scene is that Tyre is in material rebellion against God and therefore doomed, and some explorations of a corresponding spiritual reality. So what Isaiah says is nations aren't just nations, they're not just bunches of people. There's a kind of spirituality to a nation. You know, sometimes it might manifest itself in a kind of conservatism or a sort of progressivism. Other times it will manifest itself in a kind of warlike tendency or a propensity for gathering wealth, for instance. And so Isaiah says there's a kind of spiritual reality hiding behind Tyre, making everybody sort of rebel against God. Second scene is basically the devastation, and that is as simple as it is read. Scene 3, Yahweh God talks about himself as in comparison to other kings. And he says, basically, you think I'm just the God of your country and all other countries have a God. Well, that is a mistake. I'm the God of every country, and all the kings are my guys that I will allow to be in charge for a time and then judge or bless. So scene 4 is where God sort of sets up on Mount Zion to say, look, this is my place and Assyria is not going to touch it. And then there's a sort of next scene where Judeans come up to Jerusalem to seek refuge. So I don't know if you can imagine, let's say England, someone's invading and basically Jerusalem, the capital city, so it was as if London had a big wall around it, everyone would go into London, wouldn't they? And it's kind of like that. So Jerusalem's up on a hill, got good walls, very fortified. It's not very easy to attack, even though it's small. So we'll go into Jerusalem to take refuge while the siege is on, and then hopefully we'll escape with our lives, that kind of thing. And then Isaiah promises a day of reckoning, a day of the Lord, a day where God will kind of right the wrongs and make it all kind of balance out again. And that will come for both Tyre, the godless country in rebellion, and for Israel, or for the northern kingdom. Any questions or things to say at this point?
You mentioned that there was no need to, there was no alternative to accepting Assyria's sovereignty.
Mm-hmm.
But was there? You said it was no alternative, but was there actually an alternative?
Well, it depends how long the time scale is. The alternative is to trust in God, and God promises that Assyria will not directly conquer them. So Isaiah says, look, that's all we have. We've got to trust in God and just allow this storm to pass. But in the long term, God has already made his decision about the long term, that there will be the line of kings ruling in Jerusalem is more or less over. So by the end of the book of Isaiah, Jerusalem is transformed in Isaiah's speech from being a geographic kind of kingdom with a capital city to Jerusalem basically being the capital city of all the world's true faith in God. Mm-hmm. And that stuck well into the Christian period. You know, people understood that was the goal of Jesus' coming, to be enthroned in Jerusalem by the cross, and then by the resurrection and the ascendancy, to say he is the king of this place, and that makes it therefore the seat of the true faith of all nations. And that also got kind of glued into Islam when that came along later. Muhammad later seemed to sort of believe that for Islam, that if they could conquer Jerusalem, they could be the seat of faith of all nations and work that out. But in the end, Jerusalem became sort of second and third to his southern holy cities of Medina and Mecca. But regardless, it's underway. And yes, there is an alternative, which is to believe in God and allow this wave to pass. But there's no alternative for the long term, which is that Jerusalem is not going to be the seat of a kingdom anymore. God has dispensed with it as a plan. Okay? Good. Okay. So the set of scenes, page 2, has in view some more specifics of how the nations adapt or fail to adapt to God's unveiling of his plan for them. In particular view is Tyre, which is a island maritime trading hub, which is very well defended and therefore arrogant and defiant against the Assyrians. So if you can imagine a long straight coastline, a bit like what you get in southwest France, it's sort of these endless long beach. The coastline of Israel is a lot like that in a way. It's not very good for docking and ports because it's sort of shallow beach all the way along, and it's impossible to kind of get anything useful done there. So Tyre is outcrop, a bit like Portland almost. It's sort of stuck there on a small island, but it's got a bridge to the mainland and it's got a deep water port. So trading ships from Greece and Egypt and what we now call Turkey or Italy or the whole Mediterranean, Carthage, all come, and if you want to sell to the Middle East, dock at Tyre. And if you've got trade goods in the Middle East and you want to sell to the whole Mediterranean world, send them out via Tyre. It's the main trading port of the whole coastline of that part of it. So it's a huge centre for commerce, wealth, luxuries, everything passes through Tyre. So if you want the latest fashions, the latest product, the most kind of the best value on the luxury goods, you go to Tyre. Okay?
So Tyre was actually part of Israel then?
No.
No, it wasn't.
No, it wasn't. It basically marks the northern border of the original land of Israel. So when in Judges and Joshua, you've got the conquest of the land, they basically go as far as Tyre and then stop. And the tribe of Dan in the end goes up to Tyre and then turns right a little bit and goes outside of the promised land as it's delineated, which is a big problem for them later. But Tyre is the next one up, basically. It's sort of Lebanon, to borrow the modern shapes of things. But yeah, Israel really doesn't have any kind of deep water port at this time, so they're dependent on sending it to Tyre to get trade happening. They really never controlled their own coastline. It was the Philistines and the Phoenicians and Tyre and things that sort of dominated it. Israel was sort of cut off from the sea quite early in the story. Okay, let's have a look then at chapter 23 of Isaiah. I'll read it and then we'll talk about the bullet points and anything else that kind of comes up. So if you see something and you think, wow, that's really interesting, it reminds me of something, or questions, then jump in. So chapter 23, an oracle concerning Tyre and Sidon. Chapter 23, the oracle concerning Tyre. Wail, O ships of Tarshish, for Tyre is laid waste without house or harbour. From the land of Cyprus it is revealed to them, be still, inhabitants of the coastlands, merchants of Sidon who cross the sea have filled you. And on many waters your revenue was the grain of Shihor, the harvest of the Nile. You were the merchant of all the nations. Be ashamed, O Sidon, for the sea has spoken, the stronghold of the sea, saying, I have neither laboured nor given birth, nor reared young, nor brought up young women. But when the report comes to Egypt, they will be in anguish about the report over Tyre. Cross over to Tarshish and wail, O inhabitants of the coast. Is this your exultant city, whose origin is from days of old, whose feet carried her to settle far away? Who has purposed this against Tyre, that bestower of crowns, whose merchants were like princes, whose traders were honoured in all the earth? The Lord of hosts has purposed it to defile the pompous pride of all glory, to dishonour all the honoured of the earth. Cross over your land like the Nile, O daughter of Tarshish. There is no restraint anymore. He has stretched out his hand over the sea. He has shaken kingdoms. The Lord has given command concerning Canaan to destroy its strongholds. And he said, you shall no more exalt, O oppressed daughter of virgin daughter of Sidon. Arise, cross over to Cyprus, and even there you're not going to have any rest. Behold, the land of the Chaldeans, that's Babylon. This is the people that were not. Assyria destined it for wild beasts. They erected their siege towers, they stripped her palaces bare, they made her a ruin. So wail, O ships of Tarshish, for your stronghold is laid waste. In that day, Tyre will be forgotten for 70 years, like the days of a king. In the end of 70 years, it will happen to Tyre as in the song of the prostitute, whatever that is. Take a harp, go about in the city, O forgotten prostitute. Make a sweet melody and sing many songs that you may then be remembered. At the end of 70 years, the Lord will visit Tyre, and she will return her wages and will prostitute herself with all the kingdoms of the earth on the face of it. Excuse me. Her merchandise and her wages will be holy to the Lord, and they will not be stored or hoarded, but their merchandise will supply abundant food and fine clothing for all those who dwell in God's sight. There you go. So,
Can you just explain? I thought Tarshish was on Spain.
Tarshish, long way away. Yeah, it's basically saying run away from Tyre and head over to Tarshish. You know, Tarshish is some absolutely forsaken outpost of the civilized world at this time. So they're saying, you know, Tyre is the opposite. It's a bit like London. Go to Timbuktu and find out how you're going to live then. Mind you, in these days, Timbuktu was a huge trading hub of gold, and London was a swampy bit of river with people who painted themselves blue on it. So it's like that. It's saying, you know, greatest seat of civilized trade. Go and have a look at what it will be like for you on the day this judgment comes.
Has the Tower of Babel already fallen before this?
We're talking about thousands of years since ancient history. No one could possibly sort of remember. If you imagine the Bible's timeline like this, it will help you. So work in 500s. So the first kind of event which presents itself in relatively recent history is Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. So Genesis chapter 1 to 11 cover the events from between the beginning of the universe up until Abraham. And that is a very sort of tricky, indistinct period. And the writer of Genesis presents it as a sequence of perhaps 2,000 years from creation to Abraham in the Bronze Age. So the timeline, as a scientist would describe it, might be billions and billions of years from the sort of creation of the earth to the emergence of civilized humans. But the point is, at the end of Genesis chapter 11, you enter a world which you can archaeologically verify quite easily. So before that, the Tower of Babel, the flood of Noah, the Garden of Eden and things like that, those are things which are going to be, I would think, probably archaeological. You're not going to be able to find the ruins of those things because they concern areas and settlement peoples that have long since erased every trace of the memory. You know, if the things happened as they are literally described, then that's true. And if those stories are figurative representations of a kind of longer view of history, then that will still be true. But Genesis chapter 12 is where you start talking about cities that exist still and that you can find archaeological evidence of today. So where Abraham lives before he goes to the land of Shinar and then into Canaan. These things in that time are places that you can still dig up and find records of. So the cities and the people concerned are easy to find evidence of. So that's at 2000 BC. Now, shortly after Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, you get the people going down to Egypt to live for a time. Then you get the Exodus, which happens around about 1500. So there's about a 500-year period between Abraham over here and Moses in 1500 or so. Some people say Moses came quite a lot later, but I don't think so. And then you get the conquest of the Promised Land, the time of the Judges, and that's again another sort of 400-500 years until King David, where the kingdom of Israel is one united kingdom, and the king of Israel is quite a powerful figure in the region. So David and Solomon is sort of Israel's golden age around about 1000 BC, so 1,000 years before Jesus. 500 years later, the kingdom is gone. Babylon has destroyed it, and the community of the Jews are a group of exiles living in Babylon and then Persia. The end of the Old Testament kind of comes in at 500 BC. And there's a gap, which we call the intertestamental time, when Jesus appears into the world right about the year 0. It's 4 BC, but never mind. So the sequence is Jesus. 500 years before Jesus was the exile. 500 years before the exile was King David. 500 years before that was the Exodus. 500 years before that was Abraham. Now, Isaiah is writing halfway between the time of the kingdom and the time of the exile. So what he's announcing is the end of the kingdom and the beginning of the exile in advance. And people have to kind of react to that. They hated him for it the whole time he was saying it. But things like the Exodus and Abraham are already ancient history. So for Isaiah, the time of Abraham would be like the time of the Dark Ages to us, that long ago. But the time of Noah and the time of Babel is ancient history to them. He'd already be long before, out of the imagination. Were you going to say something? Okay. Sorry, you moved your hand a bit. Okay, good. So around about 700 BC, Tyre was seen to be so important as a trading hub that nobody wanted to conquer it in case their economies were damaged. Basically, you want to keep the markets alive. But Isaiah says that God has planned this from ages past. Not only that, but it was also attacked without being defeated by Assyria 5 times, Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon twice, and Persia. But it wasn't actually destroyed until Alexander the Great. He builds a causeway and sacks it in 332 BC. So this prophetic lament, or even taunt over Tyre, shows Tyre's arrogance and the certainty of her destruction and submission to God's eternal plan. And God does not seem to be in a hurry. You see that it's okay for him to sort of say what's going to happen, and then even if it doesn't happen straight away, we can still be sure that that's how it will happen. You've got a spare sheet there. Well, that was a bit of a dodgy copy. There you go. We're just on page 2 there. Flip over. So, after all, who on earth would plan to destroy the hub of money and goods? Now, famously in coups and revolutions and overthrows of leadership in history, you kind of want it to be possible to start making money again pretty quickly. Of those great things that have happened over the years, I think probably you'd say communism was the one that defied that the most. But as it turns out, I think it fell to that a little bit more than it thought. Kingdoms want people to be safe and well educated and relatively prosperous because it cements the hold on power, doesn't it? So if everyone's life is going right, they're not going to want a revolution or to kick you out. So if you conquer another kingdom, you want it to be quite soon, the time that everyone starts buying and selling and making stuff again, because that means that people will be able to be safe and well and healthy and rich, and then they'll all love you. But if you bring them nothing but prosperity and pestilence and famine and plague and such, then they're going to hate the whole time you're there, and they're going to get somebody else in. You can keep them under a jackboot and crush them to make sure that you stay in charge anyway, but that will not last forever. Eventually, all tyrants, say the prophets, all tyrants and all tyrannical outsiders who come to crush the nations will fall, and may it ever be. Make sense?
I can see so many parallels with what's going on at the moment.
Great, yeah. I mean, we're living in a time where all this stuff is still true. So tell us.
Well, the fear of the world economies falling apart, and the shutdowns and markets, etc. It's what God's doing to actually get people to realise, I'm still God, I'm still here, I'm still in control, and you're going to go through something that might bring you back to me. I'm hoping that that's the real purpose of what's going on at the moment.
Yeah.
If it's not the enemy's purpose, it's God's way of saying, hey guys, you've gone a bit too far.
Very well, very good. So, as an example, the Federal Reserve in the United States recently pumped $1.5 trillion into one particular sector, which sector do you think that was?
Real estate.
Stock market. Banks. They're not going to give it out to you and me to help us make it easy to take weeks of quarantine. Richard Branson recently announced he'd like his employees, all 8,000 of them, to take 6 weeks of unpaid leave. His total wealth is £4.2 billion. So if he wanted to, he could pay them all £500 a week out of his own pocket, and his wealth would go from 4.2 billion down to 4.088 billion, and he's not doing that. So however the financial mechanisms of all that work are beyond me, and truthfully I really don't understand money at that quantity. I really cannot even imagine the difference between $1 million and $1 billion, but actually the difference is almost $1 billion. But when we're talking about Tyre, we're talking about that kind of sum. We're talking about we cannot afford for this hub of trade to fall because it's too important for everybody. You know, if the cloth and the wool and the food and the metals and the money stops flowing through Tyre, then the whole region is going to have a recession. And recessions and inflation, they all happened in these times. It's not a modern phenomenon. And what do I really count on?
The iron, the clothes, the food, or is it in God?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, that really gets to me questioning what's going on.
Yeah.
And where is my trust going to be?
Yeah, what do I rely on? You know,
we've been promised greater authority. I mean, the New Testament, there's so much there that shows that we have got authority in Christ and we can stand up.
sure. And also the onus is on the church to provide an alternative to a system where profit is the only and highest good. We are called to that. And if we live our lives like profit's the best and highest good, then I think we're in danger of missing any of that. Because if we're not an alternative to the systems of the world, we're just a participant, then we make the gospel into nothing in our own lives. And so we have to be able to look at our own bank accounts and say, am I going to be okay if this just evaporates? Am I going to be okay if my house gets foreclosed on or I become homeless? Am I going to be okay if I can't go to church because of an epidemic? Am I going to be okay if I can't go to the shops and get food? Am I going to be able to trust God for those things even though there's no system in place to accommodate it? That's the question, isn't it, in our time? And these texts are important for that because nobody could imagine. It'd be a bit like New York getting nuked. You know, it's that serious. You know, the seat of global finance being destroyed all in one go. I mean, today's global economy is so globalized that I think perhaps we're better placed to deal with that than we were 30 years ago even. But that's how big it is. So Tyre is about to fall and God is already announcing it. And Tyre at the time is not really in much danger. It's an island kingdom. You have to have so many ships to be able to do it. And there's already loads of mercenaries and people there who are defending their patch. So it'd be very, very hard to overthrow. And in the end, it didn't happen for another 350 years. Interesting. So why does he reference Canaan in verse 11? In line with Mandy's question, Canaan is the ancient word for Israel, Judah. It hasn't really been called Canaan for 1,000 years at this point. You know, 500 to 1,000 years anyway. So that's right, yes. So that was the name for the land that God promised to the descendants of Abraham. And when the Exodus takes place, Canaan is the land they invade and displace the people and conquer. And Canaan then becomes the nation, the land of Israel, because it's named after the people that live there. So instead of Canaanites, you've now got Israelites. Instead of Canaan, you have Israel. Now, there's been some movements about what you call Israel and what you call Judah and that sort of thing. So why does he reference Canaan in verse 11? What is it that's being said?
The commission was originally to destroy all the people of Canaan.
That's right, to
So
take over the whole thing.
Tyre and so forth, the people that they didn't eliminate from there.
Tyre actually was outside of that, I believe. Tyre itself is, like I said, the sort of northern next country up, or the next land up. I don't believe it's part of what was delineated as the promised land, but I might be wrong there.
I seem to
Pretty sure.
remember that the word Canaanite can be translated as shopkeeper or businessman or something like that.
Is that right? I had no
Trade.
idea. Interesting. So it could be that. It could be a kind of literary allusion to a people or time or place that's sort of got some particular poignancy there.
But it's destroying the strongholds, yeah, that's what this chapter's about.
So
God saying, I haven't finished destroying the strongholds of Canaan yet.
and the strongholds of Canaan, instead of being outside of you and I want you to conquer them, strongholds of Canaan are now amongst you. Like, you're like the Canaanites now. You're the people that have forsaken me. You're like the godless nation I sent you originally to destroy all those centuries ago. And now,
Yeah.
you're the bad guys.
That goes through all of the prophets, really, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. It's a very, very sort of significant step change in how we look at all these things. Because what's happened is we've stopped being the people of God who get the blessing. We've started instead being the people who are standing under God's judgment because we've forsaken him. So he says, look, you're like Canaan now. Look at me, I'm the Canaan now. Welcome, dude. How's it going? If you want a cup, I think you may have to travel to the office and ask them for some, but feel free. The end of the chapter. At the end of 70 years, the Lord will visit Tyre, and she will return her wages and prostitute herself again with all the kingdoms of the face of the earth. Her merchandise and her wages will be holy to the Lord, not be stored and hoarded, but their merchandise will supply abundant food and fine clothing for those who dwell before the Lord. Now, as I said, that did not happen straight away. Tyre, the verse I've quoted here from Ezra chapter 3 verse 7 is when Ezra is there and they're rebuilding the kingdom after the Persian period, when the exiles rebuild the temple and they rebuild Jerusalem with Nehemiah. Basically something happens where Tyre once again sends wood, gold, money, equipment, stone and stuff back to the exiles in Jerusalem to rebuild the temple and the city. So that kind of comes true there, but that's 300, 400 years after this. So perhaps that's the real kind of fulfillment of that. But can that prophecy come true more than once? Because actually Tyre had a pretty rocky relationship with Babylon, Persia and Greece and Rome after it had this thing with Assyria. So how do we look at that to say what's the fulfillment of it? When should we look for those 70 years? Should we look for 70 years from its destruction under the Greeks? Or is this one of those things that's kind of open-ended and possible to interpret multiple ways?
Daniel 7s.
Daniel's 7s.
Yeah.
Okay, so Daniel gives a lot of cryptic messages about 77s and 7 of those and 7 of these. You're not sure if he's talking about weeks or months or years or centuries. And it's possible to interpret them a number of ways. It's very sort of cryptic in that way. I feel sure that because they wrote it down, there was a definite meaning that they were the original author was trying to convey. But as witnesses to the 21st century, I think we can look at it a number of different ways and we can say this was fulfilled multiple times perhaps. Okay, let's move on. Over the page to chapter 24, verses 1 to 13. I'm going to read this straight away and we'll just push through, okay? So, behold, the Lord will empty the earth and make it desolate. He will twist the surface and scatter the inhabitants, and it shall be as with people as with the priest, so with the slave, so with the master, as with the maid, so with her mistress, as with the buyer, so with the seller, as with the lender, so with the borrower, as with the creditor, so with the debtor. The earth will be utterly emptied and utterly plundered, for the Lord has spoken this word. The earth mourns and withers, and the world languishes and withers. The highest people of the earth languish, and the earth lies defiled under its inhabitants. For they have transgressed the laws and violated the statutes. They have broken the everlasting covenant, and therefore a curse devours the whole earth, and its inhabitants suffer for their guilt. Therefore the inhabitants of the earth are scorched, and few men are left. The wine mourns, the vine languishes, the merry-hearted sigh. The mirth of tambourines is stilled, and the noise of the jubilant has ceased. The mirth of the lyre is stilled. No more do they drink wine with singing. Strong drink is bitter to those who drink it. But the wasted city is broken down so that every house is shut up so that no one can enter. There is an outcry in the streets for lack of wine. All joy has grown dark and the gladness of the earth is banished. Desolation is left in the city and the gates are battered into ruins. For thus shall it be in the midst of the earth amongst the nations when an olive tree is beaten, as at the gleaning when the grape harvest is done. So, I don't know if you've ever seen olive trees being harvested before in the Mediterranean or anywhere else. What do they do with it to get the olives down?
Put a cloth over it.
Good. So you unfurl a blanket or a cloth or something, and then you shake it or you whack it, and all the olives fall down onto the blanket. You scoop them all up, and then you've got all the olives. So God says that's what the world is like. I'll stretch a blanket under you to catch the good bits, and I'm going to beat the rest with a stick. Fearsome, isn't it? It's a lot of people say, oh yeah, I like the New Testament God better. I'm like, have you read the New Testament? He's in there too. The thing is, what is judgment? It is the righteous implementation of a punishment that is deserved. So when we go to jail, it's because the law has determined that that was the penalty for the crime we committed. And if we live in a law-abiding and law-like society, then we can trust that in the end that will hold true. And what God has said is, not only you, my nation, made a law and a covenant with you and you've broken it, so I'm going to batter you, but I have actually got a charge against all nations. Every one of them has abandoned me and ignored me and broken the covenant. And so I'm going to do this not only to Israel, my people, I'm going to do it to all the world, my people. And actually, these good olives that kind of fall out in that process, I'm going to collect them up, and they're going to come from everywhere. They're going to surprise you, because you're going to find God-fearing Greeks and God-fearing Egyptians and God-fearing Babylonians, while most of your Israelite neighbours have all forsaken me. And so there's this great equalizing equality that sort of manifests itself. And all of that language of special people, special country, is being eroded by Isaiah through the voice of God. He's saying, look, don't tell me that you're my people. You haven't obeyed me once. Don't tell me that they're not my people either, because I created them too. I've been watching over them all this time, and I'm ready to make a change in the deal that God has with the people of the earth.
It's interesting that the word languishing comes over and over again. It's like, how it is now. We're just so complacent. I think the Christians, that's how I interpret it.
You almost feel like this whole thing could be read out to the global church of the 21st century to say, look, you guys are in danger of missing everything. And all the nations are being shaken. You've got to watch that you're walking in the way, because otherwise you'll miss out. He says the land or the earth. It's the same word he uses in Genesis 1 verse 1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Is the earth here best understood as the land, as in the land of Israel, or as some say, the territory of the Near East, the region of the country of Israel, or against the entire planet in an apocalyptic way? What do you think is the best way to see it when he says, behold, the Lord will empty the land and make it desolate. He will twist its surface and scatter the inhabitants. Are we talking about just the land in focus, or are we talking about the whole world?
In the King James, in verse 3, it refers to the land.
The land.
Local.
Okay.
And then in verse 4, the earth mourns and fades away. So...
I would be interested to know for sure whether they've actually interpreted the same Hebrew word in two different ways there. I'm just going to have a look at that. But there's more than one way to look at when you say the land. In the same way, it's like the days. You could say the days of a king. It's like the years or the days. It's quite a tricky thing to unpick. But so the Lord makes the earth empty and maketh it waste and turneth it upside down.
Do you mean verse 6? Was therefore a curse devours the earth.
Verse 6 says, therefore a curse devours the earth, and the inhabitants suffer for their guilt, and therefore the inhabitants of the earth are scorched. It's the same issue, basically. There's the land, which is, the Hebrew word is eretz, but it's not totally sure whether it's exactly the same. So
Everywhere else it's using the word earth.
yes,
Just verse 2 it says land.
yeah, that's what I've got here. So my concordance says that verse 1, verse 3, verse 4, verse 5, verse 6, verse 11, verse 13, verse 16 are all the kind of the earth, but verse 2 is a slightly different word. So perhaps
it could tie with what you were saying earlier, that if Tyre is ruined, it affects everybody else.
yeah,
So if
it's
the
a
local
global
land
problem.
in that area is first affected, it affects the whole earth.
I think it would be right for us to see it that way. That it's basically the God is saying that your actions affect more than just you, right? It's not just about you and your nation. It's about all people in every nation. And if you won't hold on to the promise, that's not just bad news for you. It's bad news for everyone. And the same with Tyre. If they won't yield to me, if they won't submit to my plan, then it's not just bad news for Tyre. Like, yay, Tyre goes down. But everybody, the whole earth will be shaken by it. And I mean, archaeologically speaking, there is evidence that great financial crashes happened in the ancient world in several points. You know, we've talked before in this study about the Bronze Age collapse, which is a really interesting thing that happened just before the time of the Exodus. There's other things. The ancient Romans had a terrible, grave financial crisis just before the time that they were overthrown by the Huns and the Goths, and it happens. You know, they knew what a financial crisis was. They knew what inflation was. They knew what borrowing and lending would do to the economy if they did too much of it versus how much wealth they actually had. And they were trying to make the best of it and do the most profitable thing. But occasionally they fell into problems because of that. And sometimes that was because some crazy lunatic started conquering everybody, and other times it was just because the policy was bad, and that was just the consequence of it. But are we still talking about Tyre here? Chapter 24. Probably? Oh no, they were talking about the whole earth. So we've kind of spoken for Tyre, and now we're speaking for the whole earth. And we're about to go on to the next chapter, but let's just have a look at these bullet points. So Assyria's successful and destructive campaigns in Egypt and the Levant in 677 and 668 BC would be a good place for this text's original setting. What usefulness would the word contamination have in this passage to describe, for example, sin, guilt, faithlessness, destruction, and disgrace? It's like these are pathogens that get into your human condition, and they spread like a virus. They spread like a germ or a bacteria. And God here is sort of saying that you've become contaminated. You've been, you've sort of fallen into this desolation because you're sort of scorched by your own iniquity. Do you think bad habits spread? Spread within a family, spread within a community?
A little bit of yeast spreads through the whole dough.
As Jesus said, a little bit of yeast will spread through the whole batch. And even if you're really doing a good job to look after your little patch, in the end, everything you're connected with will be affected by the stuff that's in it. So if we resolve to do something and we have the wrong idea, it will have bigger and more outlying consequences. I think the epidemic of iniquity would be a good way to describe this problem that Isaiah is announcing onto the world. And you should note that when he does it, they think they're safe. They think Jerusalem's really defensible and God's not going to allow his Zion to be overthrown. And Isaiah's saying that's not the point. Even if you survive it, this is such a big problem that eventually it's going to overwhelm you or your children or your children's children's world. And it did. The destruction comes anyway. Look at the desolate city in verse 10. Is that Zion or is that Tyre again? Can Isaiah see any future for Jerusalem where David's kingdom is restored in Jerusalem? Did you ever read any of the other prophets and find out anything about the restoration of the kingdom? Did you ever look at those passages that talk about David's line, David's root, David's branch, kind of having a new person to be a candidate to rule over Jerusalem in the future?
Salvation through a remnant, isn't it?
Salvation through a remnant. So when the Babylon thing does happen in the time of Jeremiah, there'll be a remnant. There'll be a remnant saved by the grace of God who didn't deserve it but have been selected to be God's witnesses in the time of the destruction, who will then sort of provide the seed stock for a future generation of people who walk humbly according to God's decree. So that's true. But what about a candidate for restoring the kingdom? A king, a future king, a King Arthur who's going to save us all and be our king again and have our kingdom back. Does anyone know what happens after this? Okay, so 100 years after this, Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, storms in and does defeat Jerusalem. He overthrows it, he sacks it, he takes the treasure out of the temple, he pulls the temple to pieces. It's gone, it's over. The people are scattered, the best of them are taken off to be slaves and exiles in Babylon, and the worst of them are left behind to either die or just scratch a living. 70 years that lasted, and then the exiles were allowed to return after Babylon was overthrown by Persia, and the Persians kind of were into a bit of cultural pluralism. They were like, ooh, Jewish people, you guys make a little temple and let us visit. That'd be really fun. We'd be really interested in your art and your food and things like that. We're a very multicultural society. We're into that. And so the exiles are allowed to return and they rebuild the temple. And in the Persian era, which is the time of the end of the Old Testament, there is two people who basically are being put forward by the prophets. You can read this in Haggai and Zechariah particularly. These are the books at the end of the sort of prophets section of the Bible. The two guys are Zerubbabel, which is a great name, a son of Shealtiel, and Joshua, who's the son of Jehozadak. And what the exiles think is, now at last, 300, 400 years after Isaiah, now at last, 100 years after the exile, now at last we're going to have the priesthood back, and the temple, and the kingdom back, and the throne of David. That's what they think will happen. And what does happen is the priesthood and the temple do. Excuse me. Joshua, son of Jehozadak, is the high priest, and he, you can find out about this stuff historically. It's a very well documented piece of history. Joshua, son of Jehozadak, does reinstitute the Aaron Levi Institute of Priests, and so they do the sacrifices at the temple, and then the second temple period happens. So that happens. But the kingdom thing, this Zerubbabel guy, that never happens. He rules as the governor of the Persian province of Judea, but he never becomes king. And neither does his son or 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 his son. And generations passed, centuries passed. Several times the Jews tried to become a kingdom again. And although they kind of made a fudge, they got these people called the Hasmoneans to be the king over them. That was Herod's lot. So when Jesus arrives, he's the descendant of Zerubbabel, and through Joseph, and there's a king on the throne, but he's not God's anointed king. And Jesus is from the line of David, the tribe of Judah. He stands as heir to all of those things in a way. But for centuries, we've been hoping a king would come along and reinstitute all of that, but it never does. What Isaiah is announcing is the death of the geographic kingdom of Judah. It's over, even though it's not over in his lifetime.
Would it be fair to say, even in the time of the disciples, they hadn't got that?
Absolutely.
A physical king, a physical kingdom.
Yes.
And all the messianic stuff for them related to geography and Jerusalem.
Exactly so. So the disciples periodically asked Jesus, wow, you've done a great miracle. Are you at this time going to restore the kingdom? to Jerusalem. That's what they're expecting, for this son of David to set up a throne, kick the Romans out of the promised land, and we'll all have it back again. It'll be our country. We'll Jerusalexit the Roman Empire. We'll Brexit ourselves out. And that happens after Jesus came. So Jesus came and died and was resurrected and ascended to heaven by about 33 or so AD, right? And after that happens, the Christians start spreading out all over the world. So they go first from Jerusalem, Antioch, Egypt, Alexandria, Rome, Greece, Western Turkey, and all over the world the Christians start popping up everywhere. But back in Jerusalem, there's a lot of Jewish people who still want the war, who still want the Brexit, they still want independence. And in the end, in 70 AD, which is only 40 years after Jesus died, 70 AD, they go to war. And the whole country takes up arms and kicks out the Roman garrison and says, we are now independent, you guys are gone, we're in, we're not submitting to your rule any longer. Basically, that is the beginning of the end of whatever kingdom there was. So Titus, the Roman general, not the guy in the Bible, he marches down with several legions and he basically kills everyone. So the Jews kick the Romans out and say, we're doing it at last! We are not going to have a Messiah who's like a carpenter from Nazareth. We're going to have a David, we're going to have a war, we're going to have an independence. And basically they just get curb stomped. It's awful. It's the worst conquest ever. The people survive by cannibalism, and the whole country is absolutely destitute. The Romans bring in cranes and siege engines and they dismantle the whole city of Jerusalem. They pull the Temple Mount apart brick by brick, throwing down stones that are as big as cars down the hill. You can still see them today if you go there. The big blocks of granite and limestone that's still on the bottom of the hill are the ones that Titus and his generals and his Roman legionaries displaced from the original Temple Mount. They're still there. This was the most catastrophic destruction of a nation ever. And that was a huge deal for the Christians and the Jews. It's a huge deal for the Jews because it is literally the end of their nation as a geographic entity. But it's also the end for the Christians who think that Jerusalem's got much significance for them. Because from then on it's a Roman province and it passes to Islam within a few centuries. And from then on it's basically an Islamic country, Palestine. So the whole crushing defeat that the Jewish nation suffered in 70 AD is sort of still in the chain of these same events where the kingdom is broken in the 6th century BC, and then finally we're waiting and we're waiting and waiting, it never comes back. Make sense? Oh, it's devastating history, isn't it? It's awful. I really do feel dreadful about the whole chronology of it, because the hope and the dream are based on what? Promise of God to the patriarchs. He promised, he said we would always have a home, we'd always have a land. Well, we have to be able to see this shift that takes place in Isaiah's time where he says it's not going to be like that anymore. We're not going to have a David's king sat on a kingdom. We're going to have we'll have Jerusalem be the seat of a new faith that goes to all nations. And Isaiah sees the time when Egypt and Persia and everyone are going to be blessed by the faithful people from Jerusalem, the Jews who go to the nations and proclaim the truth about the one God who created the universe and everything in it. And later on he's going to see the guy, the suffering servant who makes that all possible, but the Jewish people of his time will not recognize him when he comes. And the tragedy of it all is that doesn't stop happening to the Jewish people, it doesn't stop happening to Israel, the country, forever. It's still happening today in a lot of ways. You know, it's 80 years ago or so, the Shoah, the persecution of the Jews in the Second World War by the Nazis and others. I mean, that is an extension of this very same process of international hatred and persecution against the Jewish nation for no reason at all.
So when it says the earth mourns and fades away, the world languishes and fades away, is that talking about the very, very end time?
In a way, but I think it's right for us to see that there's a repetitious element to it. That the destruction and the promise and the certainty of the end of it all is one thing, but the signs leading up until that time will be consistent with that end goal. So make no mistake, it's definitely going to be destroyed, and everything around us is going to be destroyed. Everything's going to pass away. But until that time, there'll be some indicators of the certainty of that by the destruction of all these tyrannical empires, and by the destruction of faithless Jerusalem, and by the destruction of the temple, which has been abused and filled with idols. And that will just keep happening until you'll get your act in gear. And then it will happen again probably when everybody loses faith in future generations. And it's very sad for that reason. The whole arena, this great dance between humanity and God is not just majestic and beautiful and intimate and mystical, but also ferocious and jealous and horrendous. You know, we're really hurting our lover to reject him. You know, it devastates God, and it brings his complete fury when the people forsake him. And his whole heart is to have children from every nation and tribe and people and language and tongue. That was always the plan from Abraham onwards, from Noah onwards, from Adam and Eve onwards. The whole plan was always for a family of people called by the name of God and who call on his name. But in the end, the repeated failure of humanity to fulfill their end of the bargain means occasionally God has to blow it apart and start again with people who are prepared to take him at his word. And it's very easy to see yourself as a subject to processes that are much more earthly. You know, Western civilization is about trading and the rule of law, the institution of human rights, and the nations and people of the countries concerned. But really, it's quite hard once you get into all of that to see how God is moving through it. You know, you say, well, coronavirus happens, and what's God doing about it? Is he doing anything about it? It's very confusing for me. But what he's doing is he's calling you to respond in accordance with what he's decided, which is in love and hope and peace and faith and joy and goodness and holiness and all the other things that he's called us to. Because he doesn't promise us, I say that, I sound like a heretic, he doesn't promise us an earthly victory over every earthly force in every way that we can conceive of it. Sometimes it looks like he does, and sometimes he gives the apostles this special dispensation to be able to do things a completely different way. And can we still tap into that and see that in our day? I believe we can, but you're all still going to die as well. And our nation will fall one day, and that's okay, doesn't matter. Not in the long view, not in heaven. But what matters is that people from this island and from every country call on the name of the Lord and receive the salvation that he offers for eternal life. And on that day, everything about coronavirus will look like very small cheese. But it's very hard to live in that world and feel like that, because the heavenly reality feels like such a small part of total life. We think, what's the difference between me and my neighbour? Hardly anything, except I go to church on Sunday. Right? That is hard to see, isn't it? It's like Christianity is this tiny little sliver of my life that all the rest of the pie is sort of occupied by being a British, Western, young man, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Most of my day, even working for a church, is about being and doing things that are almost barely distinguishable from my neighbours who don't believe. Isn't that awful? Isn't that an environment that God would like to speak to and say, what I want is radical love, holiness. I want the gospel. But to do that, I have to be allowed to be subject to the forces that govern the earth, and I have to be prepared to offer a radically distinctive alternative to those forces. So I need people to notice it in the way I use my money, in the way I pray for people, in the way I work, in the way I raise my family, in the way I interact with strangers and neighbours. They need to be able to see the difference it makes, otherwise they won't see the difference it makes, and that'll be just as much of a disaster as this. How are we doing? Big breath! Okay, 24, verses 14 to 22. Yahweh and other kings. From verse 12 then. From 14. They lift up their voices, they sing for joy over the majesty of the Lord, they shout from the west. Yay! Therefore in the east give glory to God, in the coastlands of the sea give glory to the name of the Lord, God of Israel. From the ends of the earth we hear songs of praise, of glory to the righteous one. But I say, I waste away, woe is me. The traitors have betrayed with the betrayal, the traitors have betrayed. Gosh, that's a tongue twister. Terror and the pit and the snare are upon you, O inhabitants of the earth. He who flees at the sound of terror is going to fall into a pit. Word of the day. He who climbs out of the pit will be caught in the snare, for the windows of heaven are opened and the foundation of the earth tremble. Earth is utterly broken, the earth is split apart, the earth is violently shaken. The earth staggers like a drunken man, it sways like a hut. Its transgression lies heavy upon it, and it falls and not rise again. There's that word again. It falls and will not rise again. On that day the Lord will punish the host of heaven in heaven and the kings of earth on earth. They will all be gathered together as prisoners in a pit, and they will be shut up in a prison, and after many days they will be punished. Then the moon will be confounded, and the sun brought to shame. For the Lord of hosts reigns on Mount Zion and in Jerusalem, and his glory will be ever before his elders, whoever they are. Those in iniquity, and an everlasting blessing for those who follow God and take him at his word. And notice that. That's a very serious point which we'll get into another time. But often translated as punish. Have a look at verse 21 again. On that day the Lord will punish the host of heaven. Verse 21 might be better seen as that God will decide their fate, or that he will judge. What is the effect on the text if it's that as opposed to punish? What's the difference between deciding the fate and judging on the one hand versus punish on the other?
Fate, some will won't receive the punishment and others will.
Good. So he's going to do this thing, whatever it is, to everybody. And if it's punish everybody, then we're all lost. There's no hope for any of us. But if it's that God will sit in judgment and decide the fate, then it means good news for some and bad news for other. And it will be up to us to respond to him that way and vouch for the blessing instead of the condemnation. Good point. What's the best way for us to look at the kings of Israel and Judah in the context of this prophecy? What do these events have to do with God's original dream for his people? Is it lost? Was it God's original plan to have a human king of Israel? No. The people said, we want a king. And God said, well, if you want a king, I'll let you have a king. It's a bit like when my son asks for a sweetie, or a bag of sweeties, or a mile of sweeties. And I'm like, well, you can eat sweets, but if you eat sweets, this is the deal. They will rot your teeth, cause them to hurt. And they will cause you to gain and lay on subcutaneous fat. And so if you want these things, you need to take measures to adapt to the consequences. And that's what God says. He says, having a king will be like this. You'll be taxed more. You'll have to give tribute. You'll have to give homage. You'll have to pay earthly honour to him. You'll have to do everything he says. When he says there's a war, you'll have to go to war. And you won't have any choice about it. You'll just have to have it. And they say, yes, that's what we want. That's really what we want. And it's a terrible idea, and it's bound to fail. In fact, the kingdom of Israel lasts only 600 years or so. From Saul to the end of the kingdom, it's only one of our 500-year pieces, basically. So God's original plan is for him to be the king and for us to be the people. And that dream is not dead, but they're going to be tossed into a pit and punished for a very long time, Isaiah says. So God's original dream and ultimate purpose are not dead, but the temporary earthly manifestation of that is. We have to be able to see that. If we want to understand church history, you have to be able to see that the eternal principle of the redemption of humankind through the grace of God, through faith and salvation, through grace alone, that has never been ended. But the earthly manifestations of them, the human gatherings, the concrete buildings that have been used to do that, sometimes have been. And it's the same with the person. You know, the person will die and be subject to mortality. And if they're martyred, God might not stop them from being martyred. And if they die in their beds of age-related illnesses that are more usual, God also might not stop that. In fact, he certainly won't. It will happen to us all. He might not stop us getting hit by a bus or catching a coronavirus or a bubonic plague as in ages past. But what will happen is that his eternal purpose and his eternal destiny for humankind will stay the same and still always be on offer. Make sense? Great. Let's go over the page. Notice that he sits in judgment over the kings of the world. He's not just the king of his people, he's the king of kings. He's the king of all of them. They're all his people in that way. Right. Chapter 24, verses 23 to 25. Did I just read all that?
It's chapter 25 to the page.
Okay. So how far did I go? Okay, let's go from chapter 25 then, up to verse 9. O God, you are my God. I will exalt you. I will praise your name, for you have done wonderful things. Plans formed of old, ancient, faithful, and sure. For you have made the city a heap, the fortified city a ruin. The foreigner's palace is a city no more. It will never be rebuilt. Therefore, strong peoples will glorify you, and cities of ruthless nations will fear you. For you have been a stronghold to the poor, a stronghold to the needy in their distress, a shelter from the storm and a shade from the heat. For the breath of the ruthless is like a storm against a wall, like heat in a dry place. You subdue the noise of the foreigners as heaped by the shade of a cloud. So the song of the ruthless is put down. And on this mountain of the Lord the hosts will make for all peoples a feast of rich food, a feast of well-aged wine, and rich food full of marrow, and aged wine well refined. He will swallow up on this mountain the covering that is cast over the peoples, the veil that's spread over the nations. He will swallow up death forever. And then the Lord God will wipe away tears from all faces, and the reproach of the people he will take away from the earth. For the Lord has spoken. Now, we as Christians know this passage. It's used by several New Testament writers to proclaim the certainty of everlasting heaven and eternal life. Why is the destruction of cities such a big reason for these worshippers to worship God? Why is it that when the city is destroyed, we worship God?
Where the security was, most of them are walled.
Okay, so if our security is in earthly things, our celebrations will only be in about earthly things. Whereas if our security is in a heavenly thing, then our great celebration will be when the heavenly thing is unveiled. Good point, that's completely right. Some people say that shame comes from being revealed to have no meaning or significance. I quite like that. I believe that. Shame comes when you feel like you have no meaning or significance. It makes you retreat into this position of feeling always being under everybody else's feet, having no meaning or significance at all. How does that help us comprehend God versus other gods? So there's lots of gods on offer, sometimes from within single religions, there's lots of gods on offer. How does the shame that comes from being revealed to have no meaning or significance, how does it help us comprehend God? The shame of his people he will take away. Why is that such a good offer?
If people humble themselves and they turn to him, passage.
There'll be an alternative.
Yeah.
That there'll be some good news. Great, that's just right. So the whole reason shame is so powerful is because it stops us from ever rising above it. Shame is a sort of self-defeating circular problem. You know, if I have shame, then I feel ashamed. If I feel ashamed, I have more shame. And if I feel more ashamed, I feel more ashamed. And I just keep going. Something has to come in and break the cycle, doesn't it? And make a person believe that they are much more than their shameful, embarrassing, broken, wounded self. Something has to come and do that, otherwise that person will stay ashamed forever. I've seen that happen so many times. It's a dreadful problem for humanity. But what God says is that the tears will be wiped away, the relief will come, and the reproach, the shame, will be taken away. And that is what God promises. And so there has to not just be a heavenly place where that takes place, but that has to make a difference here on earth. And my embarrassment about my weakness or my failure or my iniquity or my sin or my judgment, that all has to be able to be broken here and now. So what you were saying at the beginning of the session about, does it not have any power? Yes, it does. We have to be free from those feelings of powerlessness and weakness and helplessness, because those things will stop us from doing anything useful for God. It'll stop us from receiving anything good from his hand. It will just keep us in this place where we say, woe is me and I deserve it. I'm a terrible, terrible human being. That's not good for anyone. It's not good for the earth. It's not good for heaven. Look at what God is wiping out, swallowing out, or otherwise removing. What should we understand about his actions here? So, starting from verse 7, he will swallow up on this mountain the covering that's over the people, the veil that's spread over the nations. He'll swallow up death, he'll wipe away tears, and the shame and reproach of the people. So that is a lot of things he's going to erase. Is there a pattern in there, or is it just a way of saying he's going to erase everything?
He's going to remove the bad stuff.
Well, he's only going to swallow up the bad stuff. Okay. Everyone else agree with that?
Covering these barriers.
Barriers. Barriers to what?
Barriers between him and people.
Okay, so Jesus famously, when he died, the temple curtain tore in two. And the New Testament writers who wrote after that event, they all with one accord say that, now there's no barrier between us and God. Jesus has made a bridge, he's made a way, he's, submitted an acceptable sacrifice, he's paid the redemption price, he's done everything necessary to bring us to God, to defeat this veil that's over the people. This is what Isaiah is promising. So there's a veil over them, which means that even if they were looking directly at it, they wouldn't be able to see it. And that has to do with their tears. It has to do with their reproach and their shame. It's like there's a barrier now between me and God, and I can't see him even if I'm pointed right at him. I can't see his work. I can't see him moving in the nations at all. All I can see is just the veil and everything that's about the veil. It's a corroded kind of mass that's on my face, and it's blocking me from God. And that's what Isaiah says, that will be taken away. And again, fine, it will happen in heaven, pie in the sky when you die. But actually it will happen on earth, and it will be a signal and a sign of surety for that time when people are rescued from their shame and from their embarrassment and from their blindness to God. And that will just deliver them. Isn't that good news? I think so. So the supremacy of God is not in doubt here, but what can we see about the personability or the relational aspect of God here? What is God's revealed future for this people about to experience death and destruction in unknown quantities? So death and destruction are coming, but how is a lot of Christians are like this. We kind of we're either very good on the sovereignty and greatness of God, or we're very, very good on the personal and relational nature of God. But most people kind of pick a side and stick with it. So you'll find churches full of people where we're very sort of into the greatness and unknowable holiness of God that extends into eternity in every direction. We couldn't possibly fathom him or his ways. They're so much higher and above our ways. We can't figure him out or put him in a box. We just say he is great and there's nothing I can do about it. Isn't that amazing? But the people who sort of say, no, God is intimately involved in the affairs of your day. He cares and sees and transcends and works with all of your material realities, whether it's your bank account or your parking space or your, motor neuron disease. He is in that, and he's there to be found and felt and interacted with that whole time, even if it doesn't all happen the way that you think. Do you ever struggle to solve that puzzle? Me too. I think that may be the most difficult thing in all Christianity, is to solve that puzzle. To say God is all-powerful, all-knowing, all-encompassing. There's nobody that could hold back his hand or question him about what he's done. And yet at the same time he cares for us so personally and so deeply. And yet he does not deliver us from everything we feel like we would like to be delivered from, at least in this life. There will come a day, but it's not today, probably. If you get hit by a bus on the way home, it was today. It is hard, and that is the puzzle that Isaiah is unveiling, because I think it's probably true to say that in Isaiah's time, people sort of deferred to God will look after me and my needs. He's my interpersonal God of my country, my people. Yahweh won't abandon us. And Isaiah's saying, well, he's also the sovereign of all nations, and he's doing something here that he is doing, and there's no way back from that. And so he's sort of unveiling the greatness of God to a people that aren't really acknowledging it. But that creates the other problem, which is once you've got in view the greatness of God, you sometimes kind of give in to a fatalistic sense of like, well, whatever's going to happen is going to happen. If he controls everything, then there's nothing at all I can do to stop it or hold it back or change it in any way. He's just going to do whatever he does. And so if I commit iniquity, really, that's his fault. So let's get on and sin so that we can have more forgiveness and grace and do it that way. Yeah, you notice the heresy started about halfway through that. But it is the puzzle. All right. Where are we? 20 minutes left. That's pretty good. Let's read through. So, 25 verses 9 to 12. It will be said on that day, behold, this is our God. We have waited for him, and that he would save us. Let me read it again. It will be said on that day, behold, this is our God. We have waited for him that he might save us. This is the Lord. We have waited for him. Let us be glad and rejoice in this salvation. For the hand of the Lord will rest on this mountain. Moab is going to be trampled down in his place, as straw is trampled down on top of a dunghill. And he will spread out his hand in the midst of it, as a swimmer spreads his hand out to swim. But the Lord will lay low his pompous pride altogether with the skill of his hand. That's Moab's pompous pride, not the Lord's pompous pride. And the high fortifications of Moab's walls he shall bring down, lay low, and cast to the ground into the dust. There you go. What does Moab have to do with anything? Why is that there? I think it's probably true to say it's simply that Moab is next on Assyria's list and it's just been destroyed. And so Isaiah is relating that to all this other stuff he's saying. You know, if we were saying all this stuff about the greatness of God and his personability and his intimate involvement with all of our lives, we would also mention coronavirus. You know, we'd also mention, Iran or something. You know, we would say, Iran thought they could stop it, but they can't. Right? Ever hear anyone talk like that? I did. Heard someone, that is. I didn't say that. There's an element of childish glee in Jerusalem about this revelation of God's unlimited sovereign power and destruction of Jerusalem's neighbours and competitors. So Damascus has fallen, Samaria has fallen, Moab is falling right now. Yay, we're immune. What does God feel about such littleness in the attentions of Jerusalem while he unveils his sovereign plan for all the nations? How does God feel about stuff like that? Is he glad when we gloat over the iniquitous ones who suffer?
No.
So when that Islamic cleric in Iran stands up and says, coronavirus is God's judgment on the West, then he personally gets coronavirus. So we're not supposed to share that and put a laughy face emoji on it. Is that right? I think so. Don't. Well, now I'm saying it on video, so I've already transgressed that. I'm sorry. Let's move on quickly. Over the page, 26. In that day, this song will be sung in the land of Judah. We have a strong city, he sets up for salvation. As wolves and bullocks open the gates that the righteous nation in, that faith may enter in. You keep him in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on you, because he trusts in you. Trust in the Lord forever, for the Lord God is an everlasting rock, for he has humbled the inhabitants of the height lofty city. He lays it low in the ground and casts it into the dust. The feet trample it, the feet of the poor, the steps of the needy. The path of the righteous is level. You make level the way of the righteous. In the path of your judgments, O Lord, we wait for you. Your name and remembrances are the desire of our soul. My soul yearns for you in the night. My spirit within me earnestly seeks you. For when your judgments are in the earth, the inhabitants of the world learn righteousness. If favour is shown to the wicked, he never learns righteousness. But in the land of uprightness he deals corruptly and does not see the majesty of the Lord. O Lord, your hand is lifted up, but they do not see it. Let them see your zeal for the people and be ashamed. Let the fire for your adversaries consume them. O Lord, you will ordain peace for us, for you have indeed done for us all our works. That's an extraordinary statement. O Lord our God, other lords beside you have ruled over us, but by your name alone we bring remembrance. They're dead, and they won't live. They are shades, and will not rise. To that end you have visited them in destruction and wiped out all remembrance of them. But you have increased our nation, O Lord. You have increased the nation, and you are glorified. You have enlarged the borders of the land. O Lord, in distress they sought for you. They poured out a whispered prayer when your discipline was upon them. Like a pregnant woman who writhes and cries out in her pains as she's giving birth, so were we because of you, O Lord. We were pregnant, we writhed, but we have given birth to wind. We have accomplished no deliverance in this earth, and the inhabitants of the world have not fallen. Your dead will live, their bodies will rise. You who dwell in the dust, awake and sing for joy, for your dew is a dew of light, and the earth will give birth to the dead. Come, my people, enter your chambers and shut your doors behind you. Hide yourselves for a little while until the fury has passed. For behold, the Lord is coming out from his place to punish the inhabitants of the world for their iniquity. The earth will disclose the blood that was shed upon it, and will no more cover the slain. So the scene is the destruction of Tyre, and the Judeans once again go up to Jerusalem on a pilgrimage. This act of obedience and celebration is abruptly ended by God at the end of the chapter. Is there a biblical parallel that reminds you of? What do you think about pilgrimage? Sorry, go ahead.
Is it the temple being destroyed in AD 70?
Maybe. Go on.
Well, the Jews went to Jerusalem at the temple to worship, and now that it's destroyed, they couldn't go.
What about the death of Christ?
Okay.
Because you've got sort of like triumphal entry, and then all of a sudden, within a week, it's sort of cut off.
It's all over.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. I think Jerusalem was often the place everybody ran to be saved and experience deliverance. And notice these people are like refugees, right? They're pilgrims. They're people escaping from the destruction of Moab or the destruction from Tyre. They're coming down to Jerusalem because they're saying this is the one place that's not falling under this same Assyrian boot. But he says that the pain they're experiencing, that it's normally, in the end, it yields something. He says that we haven't yielded anything. We've got all these refugees and all these people coming for relief from their distress, but we're giving birth to nothing. We're not raising anything up. And because of that, the earth itself is going to give birth to the dead. This is Isaiah's kind of first real indication of the future, where the dead will be raised and there will be a sort of blessing like the dew of the light for the ones that have died. So and he says we're blaming. It's like we have accomplished no deliverance in the world, and the inhabitants of the world have not fallen. It's like the thing we were supposed to be doing to bless all the nations that we haven't done. And so God's going to do it for us. He's going to get the grave to do it. If nobody else is going to bless the nations of the earth or let them be blessed by the promises of Abraham, then he'll get the world to do it, the rocks to do it. Amazing, isn't it? What should we learn about people and their response to the presence of God in chapter 26, verses 17 to 18? Let's read it. Like a pregnant woman who writhes and cries out in birth pains. This is what happens when God visits them. The presence of God is there and people are crying aloud, feeling like they're going to give birth.
It's intercession.
Yeah. Yeah, this is the people who have met with the presence of God, and their response is to cry out like they're giving birth. They're having someone else's pain. It's like, if I cry out in birth pains, I'm not going to bring forth a baby, because biology makes that impossible. But sometimes the presence of God will come and I'll feel completely doubled up with this same sort of pain. And although there's no baby at the end of it, that's how God connects me to these suffering people, these paths of the poor and steps of the needy. How we intervene on their behalf in the presence of God, to speak for them and to bring their case before God, to identify with them and affiliate ourselves with the lowly. So what Isaiah is presenting is a scene where the presence of God descends and the people are bowed down, crying out in pain because of the desperation of their situation, the helplessness of their position, their ability to do basically nothing at all. But God is still gathering them. He's still saying, come into my chambers, secret yourself away and be in my presence. Let me come down on you, even though it's sort of scary and painful, because that's the place of real deliverance. That's the place where you actually get free from this system of sin and death. That's the place you actually get transformed into somebody that's actually in line with my heart. It's the place of encounter where you don't leave the same, you leave different.
So, just clarity,
Uh-huh.
There's two sort of phases of coming in the presence of God. There's the first one, which one are you referring to? Because there's the bit where you come into the presence of God and you as in most of the prophets and whatever, when they came into the presence of God, what they saw was their own self, so self-reflection.
Sure, I'm iniquity. I've got iniquity.
Yeah,
I've got
yeah.
problem. I need a deliverer. Yeah.
And then the other side of it is coming in the presence of God and seeing the world as God sees the world.
Yes.
And you see that whole desperation in the sense of how the world has sunk away and shunned God and all that kind of thing, and that fills you with that pain and
Yes.
yeah.
That is true.
So which one?
I think both together, first one then the other. So I don't think you can do the second one until you've got to grips with the first thing, which is that I have iniquity. I've got sin. I'm a fallen person. I have not done the right thing. So if you want to participate in the things of God on the behalf of the oppressed and the lowly, then you have to make your peace with that first thing. I think Isaiah is basically in chapter 26 giving us a proof text for the Spirit-filled church. I think that is what we should be like, to come to terms with our true iniquity, our state of depravity, and our failure and our weaknesses and our legacy of giving birth to nothing. And then from that place of true repentance, complete surrender, knowing that we can't affect it, we can't change it, we can't do it for ourselves, we suddenly find the poor and the needy coming in, and then it's time for us to start blessing them, to speak to the nations, to be the change we'll get to see. But only after the presence of God has visited us in that moment of proper sorrow over sin, and be lifted by God's own hand back up to a place of strength and capability. And that's what Isaiah is envisioning for the whole nation, that they'll not just be a nation that's in on themselves and dealing with God for their own needs, but that then they become a beacon for all nations, and the refugees come in or the merchants go out. Either way is fine, because you're going to be blessing them, because you're going to be in a place of restoration and strength.
So pre-beatitude kind of thing.
In a lot of ways, all of Jesus' preaching is summarizing content of law and prophets. So the Beatitudes that he gives, yeah, totally, yeah. Blessed are the poor, blessed are the weak, blessed are the ones who mourn, blessed are the ones who are left out, blessed are the ones who are downbeaten and downhearted, because they're the ones that will receive this blessing. If you want to receive the blessing of God, you have to humble yourself. And humbling yourself doesn't just mean bowing your head gently and nicely. It means blubbering and crying and screaming and being frustrated and having to be devastated by the inadequacy of your own flesh to save you. You want to be a light to the nations, you have to go there first. That's the deal. So all of us, from teeny weeny babies to 99-year-old people who've been matriarchs over their little family for so many years and done so much good, all of us have to meet God in that place. And at the prayer house, one of the things that makes us so strange is that we ask God to do that regularly. Like when people start crying and wailing in church and looking like they're giving birth to something, it's like, oh good, this is a good day. Yes, this is where the real stuff is happening, because now that person's life is not going to be just a vanity and a bunch of effort to try and impress God. It's going to be the outworking of the complete power of God to save somebody who's lost. And we have to, if we want that, acknowledge A, that we start lost, and B, that God truly does deliver. And well, what else would you want to do? What else is church? It doesn't really have any other functions. That's the job, to get everybody to see the reality of this sin, the reality of the depravity, the hopelessness of his situation before God, and then announce the coming of the deliverer who's able to scoop up the leper and the orphan and the widow and bless them, bless their socks off, bless the ones that don't deserve it, bless the prodigals, bless the leaderless, rudderless people who've just been flapping around in their whole lives. Bless the people who've spent their whole lives making a monument to themselves, only to find that their whole wealth is passed away in a day, or their whole health is ruined by some unknown disease. To bless those people. Isaiah gives us the seed stock for all of that. And it's true to say that Jesus is the fulfillment of Isaiah. I mean, he's the fulfillment of all the law and the prophets, but it's so easy to see him here, isn't it? Glorious. 27. This will be our last one for today, so we'll race through. In that day, the Lord, with his hard and great and strong sword, will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, Leviathan, the twisting serpent. He will slay the dragon that is in the sea. In that day, a pleasant vineyard. Sing of it. I, the Lord, am its keeper. Every moment I water it, lest anyone punish it. I will keep it day and night. I have no wrath. Would that I had thorns and briars to battle. I would march against them and burn them all up together. Or let them lay hold of my protection. Let them make peace with me. Let them make peace with me. In days to come, Jacob is going to take root. Israel will blossom and put forth shoots and fill the whole earth with fruit. Has he struck them as he struck those who struck them? Or have they been slain as their slayers were slain? Measure, by exile, you contended with them. He removed them with his fierce breath on the day of the east wind. Therefore, by this the guilt of Jacob will be atoned for. This will be the full fruit of the removal of his sin, when he makes all the stones of the altars like chalk stones, crushed into pieces. No more Asherim or incense altars will remain standing, for the fortified city is solitary, a habitation deserted and forsaken, like the wilderness there the calf grazes. There it lies down and strips the branches. When its boughs are dry, they are broken. Women come and make fires out of them. For this is a people without discernment. Therefore he who made them will not have compassion on them. He who formed them will show them no favour. But in that day, from the river Euphrates to the brook of Egypt, the Lord will thresh out the grain, and every one will be gleaned one by one, people of Israel. And in that day a great trumpet will be blown, and those who are lost in the land of Assyria and those who were driven out to the land of Egypt will come and worship the Lord on his holy mountain in Jerusalem. Judgment for the God's people, future blessing. Leviathan here is clearly a symbolic or spiritual representation of Tyre, but other biblical references signify other things. Leviathan appears in Job, it appears in the Psalms. And why the use of that language? I think that Isaiah wants us to see, God wants us to see that nations are more than nations, and they're more than just people and money and banks and governments and things. There's a spiritual reality behind them, and God is able to sort of destroy it or allow it to thrive for a time as he pleases. And that the breaking of a nation can come with God's say-so, and the spiritual reality behind it, this sort of twisty, snaky serpent. You can see all of that language we have about the greedy dragon sitting on the treasure hoard, the snaky, twisty, reptilian kind of greedy thing. All of that sits true in this reference to Leviathan and others. This violent, explosive, enraged, but selfish and grasping covetousness that embodies all of the language of Leviathan in the Bible has extended to a whole host of imagery and references to dragony type things in mythology and history all across the world, hasn't it? That same thing in The Hobbit that sits on the dwarf's treasure pile and violently explodes when someone steals one little cup from it. That is exactly informed from this sort of description of the Leviathan behind the city of Tyre. Isaiah sings a song of the vineyard again. Chapter 1 was a song of a vineyard. He said, I had a vineyard, where is it?
Verse 2.
Verse 2.
I have no wealth.
Oh, I was looking in chapter 1 for it, the vineyard. Where's the song of the vineyard? Chapter 5, sorry, I should say chapter 5, not chapter 1. Isaiah sings a song of a vineyard. He says, let me sing a song for my beloved, a love song concerning the vineyard. My beloved had a vineyard on a very fertile hill. He dug it, did a good job, but it yielded wild grapes. It didn't produce good fruit. The parallel here is that God is looking after the vineyard now, and it will bear fruit that will bless not only the nation but the whole earth, all the nations, you see. So the vineyard has been given as a gift to God, and he's going to look after it and tend to its fruitfulness. Verse 9 is probably best understood as a question. Let me read that again. Therefore by this will the guilt of Jacob be atoned for, and this will be the full fruit of the removal of their sin, when he removes all the stones and stuff, as part of a conversation between earth and heaven, or two other speakers. So what Isaiah is pitching here is a speaker representing the earth saying, will this really come about? Will God really do this? And then the voice of heaven saying, yes, it totally will. And the sort of back and forth is quite hard to represent in English, but it seems to be that way in Hebrew. This is also a good parallel for scene 1 of Act 4 that sees exiles returning to Jerusalem after a reprieve from war and destruction is gathered and granted by God. Not yet in view are the Babylonian exiles who return 100 years into the future. That comes later. So his language about exiles here is, this is Isaiah writing 100 and some odd years before the Babylonian exiles, so he's not really got them in view, but he's got the people in view who are going to return to Jerusalem, escaping the Assyrian wars, which are currently underway. So, next week, Act 5, Requiem for the Kingdom of Judah. If you want to read it ahead, it will be chapters 28 through to 33. So, that covers Isaiah's big sort of death knell for the kingdom and its sort of full and final end spiritually and physically. It will be more gloomy and depressing stuff. No doubt we'll have extra things to say about the gloomy and depressing 21st century. But it's funny, isn't it? Like, I've been told for all these years to get off my phone and go outside, and now they're saying, no, get on your phone and stay inside. The coronavirus may impact our meetings here in other ways. The prayer house has had a bit of a Cobra committee meeting this morning and decided that since the advice from Parliament, from government, has been to not make assemblies of people, including for religious reasons, we'll probably be doing things remotely. So we'll still be doing meetings, but you might have to click a link and I'll just keep broadcasting this same stuff. You'll be able to ask me questions and we'll be able to still do it, but I think we may not be here next week. So if you've got any concerns or questions about it, I can do it all through YouTube, which doesn't need you to sign in or hand your user data over or anything. You just have to follow the link and click it and you'll be able to watch it and participate. You've got your sheets. I'll attach links to the PDF or the Google Doc version of it, so if you want to print another copy or send one to anyone else, feel free. If you want to share the links and get your friends watching, you feel free as well. And we'll try it from there. Any questions or things to say about that?
Does that mean we're not meeting on Sunday, either?
Yes. It means we'll live stream a service from somewhere that a few of us will do, and we probably won't be meeting in the school. Monday's the same. So we're going to curate some sort of live options where you can come in and share praying and things like that. It's like the catacombs again, isn't it? Hiding and living in holes in the ground. But like we've said, there is a precedent for this. You know, the church has had to survive plagues where not just 1 in 100 died, but where 1 in 2 or 3 might die.
Yeah.
The Black Death in the 13th and 17th centuries, wars that wiped out everybody. And we will do the best we can with what we have. And like I said on Sunday, our motivation is not out of fear, it's not out of a desire to control, it's not out of a panic, it's just out of love and respect to people who have to deal with the earthly reality of pathogens if they're very ill. And like I said on Sunday, you know, I'm young and relatively well, so I always assume I'll be fine, and I probably will be. But those who have to deal with health complications may well be very, very vulnerable to me, so I try not to transmit it. As you know, 2 weeks ago I cancelled Bible study because I had a heckin' cold, and I don't know whether that was coronavirus or not. I don't know if you're all going to catch it now. If you do, I'm very, very sorry. But we'll be doing live streaming to try and mitigate that eventuality a little bit in the future. Okay?
It's a fantastic opportunity as well.
Yeah.
To meet the needs of people who will at some point or another be feeling really low and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So if you have people there, you can link them to stuff like live streams and stuff like that. Get encouragement in a way probably or not, because people are busy, but when they have more time, it's a opportunity to meet.
Yeah. And I would say if you are well and you do have some money and you've got some time on your hands because you're not going to work or whatever, think about getting in touch with your life groups and your other community groups and start thinking about who lives nearby who's not got anyone to look in on them. Just check if you can pick up simple groceries. You know, it's a thing that you can do. We're not in total lockdown yet, so if you're relatively well, then I'd say take it upon yourself to try and bless the people around you out of love, and we'll deal with total lockdown if and when it comes to it. But I don't think that Britain will, and we'll see how that pans out. It might change, but
Is your church